You're fired, and next time, don't mistake carelessness for loyalty." The words landed like cold steel in the middle of the glass-walled boardroom, slicing through the low hum of laptops and whispered conversations as every head turned toward her. Lily Adams didn't flinch, at least not visibly. She stood there, shoulders squared, hands steady at her sides, even as the weight of 100 silent judgments pressed down on her. Across the long, polished table, Ethan Carter didn't look angry. That was the unsettling part. He looked calm, detached, like he had already moved on to his next decision before this one had even settled. His tailored navy suit sat perfectly on his frame, his posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the stack of reports he had just dropped in front of her. "This report," he said, tapping it once with a finger, "contains an error that could have cost this company millions. That's not a small oversight. That's a failure." The room stayed silent. No one spoke. No one defended her. Lily glanced down at the report, her eyes scanning the numbers she had reviewed 3 times the night before. Something felt off, but she didn't argue. Not here. Not now. Instead, she nodded once, a small, controlled motion. "I understand." Ethan's gaze lingered on her a second longer, searching for something. An excuse, maybe, or a crack in her composure, but found none. "HR will handle the rest," he said flatly, already shifting his attention to the next slide on the screen. Just like that, she was dismissed. Just like that, she didn't exist anymore. Lily reached down, gathering her notebook from the table. It was worn at the edges, pages filled with tight, careful handwriting. Every meeting, every detail, every correction she had ever made for people who never noticed. As she turned to leave, she could feel it. The stares, the quiet relief that it wasn't them, the unspoken agreement that in this room, mistakes were unforgivable. But right before she stepped out, she paused. Not long enough to draw attention. Just enough to reach into her bag and place a small black USB drive beside the stack of reports Ethan hadn't bothered to move. She didn't say a word. Didn't explain. Then she walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing the moment like it had never happened. Inside, the meeting resumed almost instantly, voices rising again, charts flipping, numbers being debated. But Ethan's eyes flickered, just briefly, to the USB sitting there. Unlabeled. Quiet. Forgotten by everyone else. He ignored it. For now. Because in his world, efficiency mattered more than curiosity, and mistakes had consequences. Across the city, 12 blocks and a lifetime away from that polished glass tower, Lily stepped out into the cold morning air, pulling her coat tighter around her. The wind cut through the thin fabric, biting at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, to the rent due in 4 days, to the hospital bill sitting unopened on her kitchen counter, to her mother lying in a narrow bed under fluorescent lights, waiting for a surgery they couldn't afford yet. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath fade into the gray sky. Being fired wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Not when so much depended on her. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the last folded bill she had left, then tightened her grip. No tears. Not here. Not now. Somewhere behind her, high above the street, the building she had just left stood tall and indifferent, its windows reflecting nothing but the sky. Inside, Ethan Carter moved on with his day, unaware that the smallest thing left behind on that table, the one thing he chose not to notice, would soon become the reason everything he believed about people, about loyalty, about control, would begin to unravel. The office floor had long since emptied by the time Ethan finally noticed the silence. It was the kind of silence that only came after 12-hour workdays and exhausted ambition, when even the cleaning crew moved like shadows through the halls. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie just slightly, eyes drifting across the darkened glass walls of his office. The city stretched out beneath him, glowing in scattered gold and white, but for once, it did not hold his attention. Instead, his gaze shifted to the corner of his desk, where the small black USB drive still sat, untouched, exactly where she had left it. He had almost forgotten about it. Almost. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before picking it up, turning it between his thumb and forefinger. No label. No note. Nothing to explain why she had left it behind instead of taking it with her like everything else. For a man who built his empire on control and precision, Unanswered questions had a way of lingering longer than they should. He exhaled slowly, then reached forward and plugged it into his laptop. The screen flickered as a folder appeared, simple, organized, named only with a date from the previous night. Inside were files, dozens of them, system logs, financial projections, internal communications. His brow tightened as he clicked through them, each document more detailed than the last. It did not take long for him to realize what he was looking at. The error that had triggered the morning's confrontation was there, buried deep within a chain of calculations that had been altered late in the process. But Lily had not created it. She had found it, and she had been fixing it. Quietly, thoroughly, without telling anyone. Ethan leaned forward, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes as he opened the final document. A timeline. Timestamps stretching well past midnight. 2 in the morning. 3. 4. Edits logged under her credentials, each one correcting a discrepancy, recalculating projections, stabilizing a system that could have collapsed under the weight of its own inaccuracies. She had stayed, after hours, alone, fixing a problem that was not hers to begin with. His jaw tightened. Then he noticed something else. A separate folder, smaller, almost hidden beneath the rest. He clicked it open. Inside was a single text file. No formatting, no signature, just a sentence. Do the right thing, even if no one sees. Ethan stared at the words, reading them once, then again, as if they might change the second time. They did not. They stayed exactly the same. Simple, direct, unapologetic. The room felt different suddenly. Quieter. He leaned back slowly, running a hand across his face as something unfamiliar settled in his chest. Not frustration, not anger, something heavier. Because for the first time that day, the narrative he had accepted without question began to crack. He had not fired an employee who made a mistake. He had fired the only person who had tried to fix one. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the empty office. His mind moved quickly now, retracing every detail, every assumption he had made in that room. The silence of the team, the way no one spoke up, the way she had not defended herself. Not because she could not, but because she chose not to. Ethan stood, walking to the window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. For years, he had trusted instinct over explanation, efficiency over empathy. It had built him everything he had. But tonight, it felt like it had cost him something he could not easily measure. Somewhere across the city, Lily Adams was no longer part of his world, no longer under his control. And yet, the impact she had left behind sat right there on his desk, undeniable. He turned back, grabbing his jacket without hesitation, the decision forming before he fully acknowledged it. This was not finished, not even close. Because if there was one thing Ethan Carter understood better than anyone, it was this. When something did not make sense, you did not ignore it. You found the truth. And this time, the truth had a name, a face, and a quiet strength he had completely underestimated. The city felt colder as Ethan stepped out onto the street, the late evening air sharp against his skin, but he barely noticed it as he slid into the back seat of his car, already pulling out his phone. "Find Lily Adams," he said, his voice calm, but carrying an urgency that his driver had never heard before. Employee records, last known address, emergency contacts. Everything. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a quick, "Yes, sir." Ethan leaned back, his mind still replaying the files, the timestamps, the quiet evidence of effort no one had asked for and no one had acknowledged. The car moved through traffic, headlights streaking past in long lines of white and red, but his focus stayed fixed on one thing. He had built an empire by trusting data, by believing that numbers told the truth. Tonight, the truth had been hidden in effort, not outcomes. 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed. A single address appeared on the screen. No luxury apartment. No high-rise. Just a narrow street on the edge of the city, the kind most people passed without noticing. "Take me there," he said immediately. The driver hesitated for half a second, glancing at him in the rearview mirror, then nodded and changed direction. As the skyline faded behind them, the streets grew quieter, dimmer, less polished. Storefronts with flickering lights. Sidewalks with cracks that had been there for years. The car slowed as they turned onto a block lined with aging buildings, paint worn, windows dim. Ethan stepped out before the driver could open the door, his shoes hitting the uneven pavement as he looked up at the address again. This was where she lived. Not a place someone chose. A place someone ended up. He walked toward the entrance, pushing open the heavy door that creaked softly, the hallway inside narrow and faintly lit. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the walls. He climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the quiet, until he reached the number he was looking for. He paused there for a moment, his hand hovering near the door. This was unfamiliar territory. Not the building, not the neighborhood, the situation. For once, he was not in control. Then he knocked. There was no immediate answer, just silence. He waited, then knocked again, a little firmer this time. A soft sound came from inside, followed by the faint shuffle of movement. The door opened slowly. Lily stood there, her expression shifting from confusion to something more guarded the moment she recognized him. She looked different without the office lights, without the structured environment that had defined her role. Her hair was loosely tied back, a simple sweater wrapped around her shoulders, her posture more relaxed but her eyes sharper, more aware. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady, though surprise lingered beneath it. "I did not expect to see you here." Ethan met her gaze, the words he had rehearsed. On the way over suddenly feeling insufficient. "We need to talk." She studied him for a second, then stepped aside without a word, allowing him to enter. The apartment was small, modest, clean, but clearly lived in. A single couch, a small table, stacks of papers neatly arranged in one corner. But what caught his attention immediately was the quiet sound coming from the next room. A steady, rhythmic beeping. Lily noticed his glance and spoke before he could ask. "My mother," she said simply. "She is resting." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of that detail settling into place alongside everything else he had learned. This was not just about a job. This was about responsibility, sacrifice, choices made when no one was watching. He turned back to her. "The error in the report," he began, his tone different now, less commanding, more measured. "It was not yours." Lily held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No," she said quietly. "It was not." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was honest. For the first time since he had walked into that boardroom, Ethan Carter did not have the advantage. And he knew it. For a moment, neither of them moved. The faint hum of the small apartment filled the silence, along with the soft, steady rhythm of the machine in the next room. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in a space like this, his tailored coat, his polished shoes, everything about him belonging to a world that felt miles away from where he was standing now. Lily crossed her arms lightly, not defensively, but with a quiet sense of control, as if she had already decided how this conversation would go long before he arrived. "You said we need to talk," she said, her voice calm, almost neutral. "So talk." Ethan took a slow breath, choosing his words more carefully than he ever had in a boardroom. "I reviewed the files you left," he said. "Every one of them." Her expression did not change. "Then you already know what happened." He nodded. "I do. And I was wrong." The words felt unfamiliar, heavier than they should have, but he did not look away. Lily studied him for a moment, searching his face for something, insincerity, perhaps, or hesitation, but found none. Still, she did not respond right away. Instead, she walked past him toward the small kitchen, pouring a glass of water before leaning lightly against the counter. "You built your entire company on being right," she said quietly. "So that must have been difficult to admit." There was no accusation in her tone, just fact. Ethan followed her with his eyes, then took a step further into the room. "It is not about being right," he replied. "It is about making decisions quickly. That is what leadership requires." Lily gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "No," she said softly. "That is what control requires." The words settled between them, sharper than anything either of them had said so far. Ethan did not respond immediately. For the first time, he was not calculating the fastest path forward. He was listening, actually listening. "You could have said something," he said after a moment. "In that meeting, you could have explained." Lily shook her head gently. "Would it have mattered?" she asked. "You had already decided." He opened his mouth, then stopped, because he knew she was right. He had decided before she ever had the chance to speak. "I did not want to argue," she continued, her voice steady. "Not in front of people who were already waiting to see me fail." Ethan's brow tightened slightly. No one was waiting for that. Lily met his gaze directly this time. They did not have to wait, she said. They just had to stay quiet. The room fell silent again, the truth of her words lingering in the air. Ethan glanced toward the doorway leading to the other room, the quiet reminder of everything she was balancing pressing in on him. Why did you stay? He asked suddenly. After hours. After everyone left. You knew the mistake was not yours. You could have walked away. Lily looked down at the glass in her hands, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. Because it would have affected people who had nothing to do with it, she said. Employees. Clients. People who trust the company to get things right. She looked back up at him, her eyes clear, unwavering. I did not do it for you. Or for the company name. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Ethan felt something shift again, deeper this time. This was not ambition, not strategy. It was something he had not accounted for in years. And the note? He asked quietly. On the USB. Lily's lips pressed together for a brief second before she answered. That was not for you, she said. That was for me. A reminder. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that. Even now, she was not trying to impress him, not trying to prove anything. She had already proven everything without saying a word. I want you to come back, he said finally, the sentence direct but stripped of its usual authority. Lily did not react the way he expected. No relief. No gratitude. Just a quiet, measured look. No, she said. The answer came without hesitation. Ethan blinked, caught off guard for the first time that night. No, he repeated. I appreciate that you came here, she said, setting the glass down gently. And I appreciate that you admitted you were wrong. But that does not change what happened. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. You did not just fire me, she continued. You dismissed me, without listening, without questioning. And that tells me everything I need to know about how you see people. Ethan took a step closer, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in something closer to urgency. Then let me change that, he said. Lily held his gaze, steady, unshaken. That is not something you prove with words, she replied. That is something you prove with actions. And just like that, the balance shifted completely. Because for the first time in a long time, Ethan Carter was not the one setting the terms. He was the one being tested. The words lingered in the air long after she said them, quiet but immovable, like a line that could not be crossed twice. Ethan stood there, feeling something unfamiliar press against his usual certainty, something that did not yield to logic or authority. For the first time, there was no immediate solution he could reach for, no decision he could enforce to change the outcome. Lily had drawn a boundary, and it was one he could not negotiate his way around. He exhaled. Slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the dim hallway where the soft beeping continued, a steady reminder of the life she was holding together piece by piece. What does she need? He asked, his voice lower now, less like a command and more like a question he was not entirely used to asking. Lily followed his glance, her expression softening just slightly before returning to its steady calm. Time, she said, and a surgery that costs more than I make in a year. There was no bitterness in her tone, no attempt to make him feel guilty. Just truth. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that, the weight of it settling deeper than he expected. I can help, he said. The words came naturally, almost instinctively, the way he solved problems in every other part of his life. Resources, solutions, efficiency. Lily shook her head before he could continue. No, she said gently, but firmly. Ethan frowned slightly, not in frustration, but in confusion. You just said, I know what I said, she interrupted softly. And I also know what you are offering. She stepped closer, not confrontational, but clear, her eyes meeting his with quiet certainty. You are trying to fix this the way you fix everything else. Fast, clean, transactional. The word hung there, heavier than the others. Ethan did not deny it. Because she was right. That was exactly what he was doing. This is not a transaction, she continued. And I am not a problem you get to solve. He studied her face, the conviction in her voice, the strength that did not rely on volume or force. It was steady, unshaken. Then what do you want? He asked. It was a simple question, but it carried more weight than anything he had said since walking into her apartment. Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she did not know the answer, but because she knew exactly how difficult it would be for him to understand it. I want to know that the place I work values people more than numbers, she said. I want to know that if someone makes a mistake, they are given a chance to explain before they are dismissed. Her voice softened just slightly. And I want to know that the person leading that company understands the difference. Ethan felt the words settle into him, not as criticism, but as something far more challenging. A standard, one he had not been measured against before. You are asking me to change how I lead, he said quietly. Lily held his gaze. I am asking you to see people, she replied. The simplicity of it made it harder, not easier. Because there was no strategy in it. No formula. Just awareness. Ethan looked down for a moment, his thoughts moving through everything he had built, every decision made in the name of efficiency, every moment where speed had replaced understanding. It had worked. It had made him successful. But standing here, it felt incomplete. He looked back up at her, something shifting again, deeper this time. If I do that, he said slowly, if I prove it, not just to you, but to everyone, would you come back? Lily did not answer immediately. Her eyes searched his, not for confidence, but for intention, for sincerity. That depends, she said finally, on whether you are doing it to bring me back, or because it is the right thing to do. The words echoed the message she had left behind, the quiet principle that had guided her actions long before he ever noticed. Ethan let out a slow breath, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his expression, not out of amusement, but recognition. That seems to be a theme with you, he said. Lily returned the smallest hint of a smile. It works, she said simply. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different. Not tense, not uncertain, just still. Ethan glanced once more toward the hallway, then back at her. I am not going to offer you money, he said, or make promises I cannot prove yet. Lily nodded slightly, as if that was exactly what she expected him to say. But I am going to fix what I broke, he continued. Not just with you, with the company, with how decisions are made. He paused, his voice steady, grounded in something more deliberate now. And I will do it whether you come back or not. Lily watched him closely, the silence stretching just long enough to matter. Then she gave a small nod. Not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. Good, she said softly. And for the first time since he had walked in, Ethan Carter understood that this was not about winning her back. It was about becoming someone worthy of the choice she had already made. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Ethan sat in silence, the city lights passing by in blurred reflections against the window, but his mind was not on the skyline he had once admired as a symbol of everything he controlled. It was on a small apartment, a quiet voice, and a sentence that refused to leave him alone. Do the right thing, even if no one sees. By the time the car pulled up to the office tower, the building stood almost empty, its towering glass exterior reflecting a version of him that no longer felt entirely accurate. He stepped inside without hesitation, the lobby echoing faintly under his footsteps as the night guard gave him a surprised glance. Ethan did not slow down. He moved straight to the elevator, pressing the top floor button, watching the numbers climb in silence. When the doors opened, the executive floor greeted him with the same polished stillness, but something about it felt different now. Less impressive, more hollow. He walked into his office, setting his jacket aside before immediately turning on the lights in the main workspace. Row after row of empty desks stretched out before him, each one representing a person he had never truly stopped to understand. For years, they had been roles, outputs, performance metrics. Tonight, they felt like something else entirely. He moved quickly, pulling up internal reports, access logs, communication records. The same data he had reviewed earlier, but this time with a different intention. Not to confirm efficiency, to find truth. It did not take long. The error that had triggered everything traced back to a mid-level manager in operations, a man who had adjusted projections to meet unrealistic targets, assuming no one would notice the discrepancy in time. The team had seen it. They had hesitated. No one had spoken, except Lily. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. This was not just a single mistake. It was a pattern, a system that rewarded silence and punished accountability. He straightened, already moving toward the next step. By midnight, emails were sent. Not the usual brief, controlled messages he relied on. These were direct, specific, a mandatory meeting first thing in the morning. Full attendance required. No exceptions. He paused for a moment before hitting send, his reflection faint in the darkened screen. Then he clicked. The message went out instantly, reaching every level of the company. For the first time, the decision was not about protecting the company's image. It was about confronting its reality. The next morning, the boardroom filled faster than usual. Conversations were quieter, more cautious, as employees took their seats, sensing something different in the air. Ethan entered last. Not rushed, not distracted, focused. He stood at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the room, lingering just long enough on each face to make them aware that he was actually seeing them. Yesterday, he began, his voice steady. A decision was made that should not have been made. A ripple of unease moved through the room. This was not how these meetings usually started. Ethan placed a file on the table, the same report that had been used as justification. This error, he continued, was not caused by the person who was held responsible. Silence. Complete and immediate. No one moved. No one spoke. It was caused by a failure in leadership, he said, his tone firm but controlled. My failure. That landed harder than anything else. Because it was not just an admission. It was a shift. Ethan turned slightly, activating the screen behind him, pulling up the system logs. Names. Timestamps. Evidence. Clear. Undeniable. This company does not move forward by hiding mistakes, he continued. It moves forward by addressing them. His eyes settled on the manager responsible, not with anger, but with certainty. Effective immediately, your position is terminated. There was no raised voice. No spectacle. Just a consequence aligned with truth. He let the moment settle before continuing. But this is not just about one person, he said. This is about a culture that allowed silence to feel safer than honesty. He stepped forward. Slightly, his voice lowering, not in intensity, but in clarity. That changes today. The room listened in a way it never had before. Not out of obligation. Out of attention. From this point on, every employee in this company will have the right to be heard before any decision is made about their role, he said. Questions will be asked. Context will be considered. And no one will be dismissed without being given the opportunity to speak. The words were simple, but they carried weight because they were different. Because they were not about performance. They were about people. Ethan paused, his gaze steady. If we are going to expect accountability, then leadership must be accountable first. The silence that followed was not the same as before. It was not fear. It was something closer to respect. Not given freely, but beginning to form. And somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment far removed from glass walls and boardrooms, the ripple of that decision had already begun, even if she did not know it yet. Because for the first time, Ethan Carter was not leading from control. He was leading from understanding. And that changed everything. By the time the meeting ended, the energy in the room had shifted in a way no one could quite put into words. People did not rush out like they usually did. They stayed seated a second longer, exchanging quiet glances, as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. Ethan did not linger. He closed the file in front of him and walked out without another word. But the silence he left behind was different now. It was not fear. It was reflection. Back in his office, he stood by the window again, the city stretching endlessly beneath him. But this time, he was not looking at it as something he owned. He was looking at it as something he had been disconnected from. His phone buzzed softly on the desk behind him. A message from Human Resources. The termination had been processed. The internal memo had been sent. The policy changes were already being drafted. Efficient. Immediate. Just like everything else he had ever implemented. But this time, it felt different. Because this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. He turned back toward his desk, his eyes landing on the empty space where the USB drive had been the night before. The words from that file had not faded. If anything, they had settled deeper into him. Do the right thing, even if no one sees. He picked up his phone, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before dialing. The call connected quickly. St. Mary's Hospital, a calm voice answered. Ethan straightened slightly. I would like to speak with the billing department, he said. There was a brief hold. Then another voice came on the line. This is billing. How can I assist you? Ethan's gaze shifted to the skyline again, his tone steady, controlled, but quieter than usual. I need information on a patient, he said. Margaret Adams. There was a pause, keys clicking softly in the background. Yes, I have her file, the voice replied. Is this regarding payment? Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. Yes, he said. It is. Across the city, Lily sat beside her mother's bed, her fingers gently adjusting the thin blanket as the steady rhythm of the monitor continued its quiet reassurance. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, the overhead lights casting a soft, pale glow over everything. Her mother's breathing was even, peaceful for now, but Lily knew it would not stay that way forever without the surgery. The doctor had been clear. Time mattered, and time cost money, more than she had. She leaned back slightly in the chair, exhaustion catching up to her in waves she had been holding off for days. Losing her job had not broken her, but it had tightened the clock in a way she could not ignore. Still, she did not regret what she had done. Not the late nights, not the silence, not even the moment she walked away without defending herself. Because at the end of it, she still had something that could not be taken from her. She had done the right thing, even if no one had seen it. Until now. Somewhere else in the city, Ethan ended the call, setting his phone down carefully as the weight of the conversation settled in. Numbers had been discussed. Large ones, the kind that would have once felt insignificant to him in the context of business decisions. But this was not business. And for the first time, he did not treat it like one. Process it anonymously, he had said. No name attached. There had been a pause on the other end. Are you sure, sir? Yes. He had not hesitated. Because this was not about recognition. It was about action. Real action. The kind that did not require acknowledgement to matter. He walked back to the window, his reflection faint against the glass, but something about it looked different now. Not softer. Not weaker. Just more aware. The next morning, Lily arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, her steps quick, her mind already moving through everything she needed to handle that day. But as she reached the front desk, something unexpected happened. The nurse looked up at her with a small, surprised smile. Miss Adams, she said, we were trying to reach you. Lily frowned slightly, her heart tightening instinctively. Is everything okay? The nurse nodded quickly. Yes, everything is fine, she said. Actually, better than fine. Lily stepped closer, confusion flickering across her face. What do you mean? The nurse glanced down at the file, then back up at her. Your mother's surgery, she said. It has been fully covered. The words did not register immediately. They hovered in the air, almost unreal. Covered, Lily repeated softly. Yes, the nurse confirmed. Paid in full. This morning. Lily's breath caught slightly, her mind racing through possibilities that did not make sense. By who, she asked. The nurse shook her head gently. It was anonymous, she said. No name. Just instructions to proceed as soon as possible. The room felt still for a moment, the sounds around her fading into the background as she absorbed what that meant. Anonymous. No name. No recognition. Just done. And for reasons she could not fully explain yet, her thoughts did not scatter in every direction. They settled on one person. Not because he had said he would do it, but because of the way he had looked at her before he left. Like he finally understood something he had missed before. Lily exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for a brief second before lifting again. Steadier now. Somewhere in the city, a man who had always believed in control had chosen to act without it. And whether he realized it or not, that was the moment everything truly began to change. The hospital hallway felt quieter than usual, as if even the air had softened in response to something unseen but deeply felt. Lily stood outside her mother's room, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, her thoughts still circling the same question over and over again. Anonymous. No name. No explanation. Just action. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving to the bed where her mother lay resting, the steady rhythm of the monitor now carrying a different weight. Not uncertainty, not fear, but possibility. She pulled the chair closer, sitting down gently, her fingers brushing against her mother's hand. You are going to be okay, she whispered, her voice barely above the quiet hum of the room. And for the first time in days, she believed it without hesitation. But belief did not erase curiosity or instinct, because deep down, she knew this was not random. It was intentional, and there was only one person who had both the means and the reason to do something like this without taking credit. Ethan Carter. The name lingered in her mind, not with resentment like before, but with something more complicated. Understanding, maybe even respect. Back across the city, Ethan stood in the middle of the executive floor, watching as something subtle but undeniable began to shift. Conversations were different now. Not louder, not more chaotic, just more honest. Employees who once stayed silent were beginning to speak, cautiously at first, but with growing confidence. Meetings were slower, yes, less efficient by his old standards, but more accurate, more real, and as frustrating as that might have once felt, he found himself allowing it, encouraging it, even when it challenged him, especially when it challenged him. He walked past rows of desks, no longer just seeing roles or output, but individuals, people with perspectives he had never taken the time to consider. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was gradual, intentional, and it required something he had rarely practiced before: patience. His phone buzzed softly in his hand, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from the hospital. Surgery scheduled. Everything ready. He read it once, then locked the screen, slipping the phone back into his pocket without a word. No acknowledgement. No satisfaction. Just a quiet sense that something had been set in motion exactly the way it needed to be. Later that afternoon, Lily stood by the hospital window, the sunlight casting a soft glow across the room as doctors moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for the procedure. She had signed the forms, answered the questions, and still, a part of her mind remained fixed on the unanswered detail. Who? Not because she needed to thank them, but because she needed to understand. Her gaze drifted toward the city beyond the glass, her thoughts aligning with a decision she had not planned to make when the day began. She reached for her phone, hesitating for only a second before dialing a number she knew by memory. The line rang once, twice, then connected. Ethan Carter. His voice came through, steady, composed, but there was something different beneath it now. Awareness. Lily did not speak immediately. She let the silence sit between them for a brief moment, enough to say what words could not. You did not have to do that, she said finally, her voice calm, measured. There was no accusation in it, no demand, just truth. On the other end, Ethan stood still, his grip on the phone tightening slightly, not out of tension, but out of recognition. She knew. Of course she did. It was the right thing to do, he replied simply. Lily closed her eyes for a brief second, a faint breath leaving her lips as the answer settled exactly where she expected it to. No denial, no explanation, just the same principle she had lived by. She opened her eyes again, her gaze steady. Then you are learning, she said softly. There was a pause, not empty, but filled with something unspoken. Growth, change, possibility. Ethan allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, though she could not see it. I am trying, he said. Lily nodded to herself, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone before relaxing. Again, good, she replied. Because this is not about me coming back. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, but he did not interrupt. This is about who you are when no one is watching, she continued, and what you choose to do with that. The words landed gently, but they carried weight, the kind that did not fade easily. Ethan glanced out at the city once more, his reflection steady in the glass, no longer distant from the person he was becoming. Then I will make sure it counts, he said. Lily's lips curved into the faintest smile, not because everything was resolved, but because something real had begun. We will see, she said quietly. The call ended without another word, but neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. Because for the first time, the connection between them was not built on position or circumstance. It was built on something far more difficult to earn: trust in progress. And somewhere between a hospital room and a glass tower, two very different worlds had begun to meet in the only place that truly mattered. Not in status, not in power, but in the quiet, undeniable space where actions spoke louder than anything else. The hours passed slowly in the hospital, measured not by clocks but by quiet footsteps, soft voices, and the steady rhythm of machines that now carried hope instead of fear. Lily sat just outside the operating room, her hands folded together in her lap, her eyes fixed on the closed doors that separated her from everything she had been holding together for so long. She had done everything she could. She had worked, sacrificed, stayed silent when it mattered, spoken when it counted. And now, for the first time, the outcome was no longer in her hands. But she was not alone in that moment. Not really. Miles away, in a place built on glass and control, Ethan stood in a boardroom that felt different than it ever had before. Not because of the space itself, but because of the way he stood in it. There was no presentation waiting behind him, no numbers to justify his decisions. Just people, real people, and a decision that would define more than just the company. "There is one more change," he said, his voice steady, carrying clearly across the room. Every eye was on him, but this time he did not see pressure. He saw expectation. "Effective immediately, we are introducing a new role," he continued. "An internal advisor focused on accountability, ethics, and employee advocacy." A quiet ripple moved through the room, not confusion, but curiosity. This was new, unfamiliar. Ethan allowed the moment to settle before finishing. "Someone who will have the authority to question decisions, including mine." That landed differently, because it was not just policy. It was vulnerability, a shift in power. He did not explain further. He did not need to, because the message was clear. This was not about control anymore. It was about balance. Back at the hospital, the doors finally opened. Lily stood immediately, her heart tightening as the doctor stepped out, his expression calm, professional, but carrying a softness that had not been there before. "The surgery was successful," he said. The words hit her all at once, relief rushing through her in a way she could not contain, her shoulders dropping as a breath she did not realize she was holding finally released. "She is going to be okay," he added. Lily nodded, her eyes closing for a brief second as everything settled into place. Not just survival, a future, a real one. Later that evening, the city felt different. Not quieter, not slower, just lighter. Lily stood outside the hospital, the cool air brushing against her face as she looked out at the skyline she had once felt so far removed from. Now, it did not feel distant. It felt connected, because somewhere in that city, a man who had once represented everything she did not believe and had chosen to change. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because he finally understood what it meant to do the right thing. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. A message. Simple. No title. No formality. Just a location and a time. She looked at it for a moment, then smiled faintly before slipping the phone back into her pocket. The next evening, she walked into the building again. Not as an employee. Not yet. Just as herself. The lobby felt the same, polished and precise, but the way people looked at her had changed. There was recognition now. Respect. Not because of what had happened, but because of what had been revealed. When the elevator doors opened, Ethan was already there, standing near the window, the city stretching behind him. He turned as she stepped in, his expression steady, but no longer distant. "You came," he said. Lily walked further into the room, her posture relaxed, her gaze clear. "I said I would see," she replied. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but meaningful. Ethan stepped closer, not crossing the space too quickly, not assuming anything. "Everything I said," he began, "it was not for you to come back." Lily raised an eyebrow slightly, a hint of curiosity in her expression. "Then why say it?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze directly. "Because it needed to be said," he answered. "And done." She studied him for a moment, searching not for perfection, but for truth, for consistency between words and actions. And for the first time, she found it. Not complete, not finished, but real. "The role you announced," she said after a moment. "You want me to take it?" It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "Not because you need a job," he said, "but because the company needs someone who understands what it means to stand up when it is easier to stay silent." Lily let the words settle, her eyes drifting briefly to the city beyond the glass, then back to him. "And what happens when I disagree with you?" she asked. Ethan did not hesitate. "Then I listen," he said. The answer was simple, but it carried everything. Lily smiled slightly, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to show that something had shifted, something had been earned. "Then I will consider it," she said. Ethan allowed himself a small breath, not relief, but acknowledgement. This was not the end. It was not a perfect resolution. It was something better. A beginning built on choice, not circumstance. And as they stood there, two people from completely different worlds, the distance between them no longer felt like a divide. It felt like a bridge. Because in the end, it was never about wealth or status or power. It was about who you chose to be when it mattered most. And for both of them, that choice had changed everything.